people have blamed Hoover for the Great Depression. What Hoover is guilty of isn't the Great Depression. What Hoover is guilty of is his response to the Great Depression. Harding and Coolidge, in terms of their policies, and it wasn't all their fault, but the policies that they suggested probably were more at fault for long-term causes leading to the Great Depression. Presidents oftentimes are not judged based on what they do or long-term, they're based on how they react to what's given to them. And Hoover had very little time as president when he wasn't under fire because of the Great Depression. He takes over in 1929, and then in October of 1929, specifically late October 1929, the stock market crashes. And when the stock market crashes, everyone thinks that's what causes the Great Depression, but that's not necessarily accurate. It's kind of like remember in World War I, we talked about that there were those long-term causes like the arms race and nationalism and alliance structure, and that's what really was a long-term cause. And Franz Ferdinand being assassinated got it going. That was a short-term cause, but it probably would have happened anyway. The stock market crashing in October 1929 on Black Tuesday, that didn't make the Great Depression happen. It didn't help anything, but it got it going. And because of the long-term cause of the Great Depression, it was going to be inevitable. So Hoover comes in, he's pretty qualified, he comes in, and the stock market crashes. Well, let's talk about why the stock market crashes. Number one, let's talk about two markets. There's a bull market and there's a bear market. The bull market is an increasingly vibrant market where the stock market itself is going up. The Dow Jones. The Dow Jones Industrial Average is it's actually a formula used of the 30 largest companies in the country that represent several different, in fact, many of the biggest markets, right? So Walmart is the largest discounter in the country, and it's on the Dow Jones, the representative of that industry. And there's a formula that based on those stock prices going up, the Dow Jones would go up, the Dow Jones would go down if those stock prices went down. Sometimes it's called blue chips. But a bull market is when the stock market is increasing in value, and the bear market is when it's going down. And so Hoover comes in, and he is the great engineer, he's the wonder boy, and the stock market dips. And why does the stock market dip? Well, it dipped for a couple of reasons. One is called margin buying. Alright, with margin buying, that is buying stock with money you don't have. So you're buying on the margin. So when you have $1,000, you would think theoretically you could invest $1,000 in the stock market. That's not how it works. With margin buying, you could borrow up to 95% of the money you could invest. So, for instance, you could invest you could borrow $9,000, have your own $1,000, and you could invest $10,000 in the stock market, where only 10% of it's yours. And obviously the goal, the hope, is that this money, that the stocks will go up. So let's say the stock goes up. Let's say it's you put $10,000 in the stock market, and let's say it's however much per share. If the stock doubles in price, now you're at $20,000. So what you do is you sell off, you get your $20,000, you pay your $9,000 off that you borrowed. You start off with $1,000, so you made $10,000 only by having $1,000. You made a huge investment. In fact, so many people were doing this that it was half the stock market. Half the stock market's value was on borrowed money. Well, alright, what's the big deal with that? The big deal is that when the stock prices go down a little bit, everyone gets nervous and they begin selling off because they have to pay back this loan and they can't afford to let the stock ride. They can't afford to see how far it will go down before it goes back up because they owe money. So what happens is they begin to sell. Well, when large amounts of selling goes on, that causes less demand for the stock, which means the prices will go down. So in reaction to that, more people sell off. So in reaction to that, the price goes down. So in reaction to that, more people sell off. In reaction to that, the price goes down. And suddenly you have a spiraling set of prices in the stock market, and no one's willing to step up and buy it because so many people have borrowed money. And they're unsure of it. Now the stock market rebounded a little bit over a couple of months, but the point is that so much money was lost, so much wealth was lost, that it really gets to the Great Depression going. So this is the short-term cause of it. And essentially, what do we call this? When we think of our panics, what do we call this? We call this over-speculation, right? All the panics we've talked about so far, normally dealing with railroads, have all dealt with land or railroad speculation and then too much of it, which is over-speculation. This is exactly what happens in the stock market that gets it going. What happens in the Great Recession, right, of the last 2 years, is there was over-speculation in the housing market. That's essentially what happens. Let's talk about the long-term causes of the Great Depression. Well, there were several of them. The long-term causes of the Great Depression are, number one, weak industries. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go over long-term causes, and then I'm going to stop. We'll review it because I think we'll be in school tomorrow, and then we'll finish this up and I'll ask any questions. So hopefully we should be good to go. I'm probably going to move the test back to Wednesday. So between tomorrow us being in school plus this, well, we're not going to have class for a long time because there's advising sessions and because there's clubs. And then Tuesday we'll finish everything up. So we'll only miss one day because of the snow. But let's get back to this. So weak industries. Industries like the lumber industry, because steel had become so powerful that lumber was losing lots of workers, and those workers couldn't buy anything. Remember, consumers need jobs to get paid. And when they get paid, they buy stuff, and that creates more demand for more products, which creates jobs. But once people start getting laid off, it creates a chain reaction of consumers can't buy. And when they can't buy, that doesn't create demand, which loses more jobs. So specifically like lumber industry, the railroad industry obviously lost influence with cars. So that's going to be one. Another big one is going to be overproduction and underconsumption. So Americans, while the 20s were great, jazz age, partying, drinking, going out, great time, consumerism, baseball, radio, airplanes, cars, great times. The average American didn't really increase his wages that much in the 20s. But we were producing so much stuff. So what happens, we have overproduced, but we're not buying enough of it. So huge amounts of inventory sitting around not being met or being bought, so people get laid off. And that's going to happen. It also goes into the next one, which is an uneven distribution of income. Income itself was focused very high at the top, and the bottom ranks didn't have as much of it. In fact, everyone always talks about, I wish we can go back to the 50s, where back when it was, you know, when America was great. Americans, I wish, knew what they were talking about. The 50s economically were okay. For white middle class, it was great. We had a huge middle class. That was the goal, the middle class. An unbelievable disproportionate amount of African Americans were in the poor class. In fact, 20% of America was in poorer class. No one ever talks about that because they want to make the 50s look out to be the greatest time in the world. That being said, for those people who want to go back to those ways, taxes were much higher in the 50s than they are today. Much higher. The average wealthy person didn't have nearly the wealth they have today in relation to the middle class, but the middle class was making pretty good money. In fact, they were increasing their wages. In the 20s, also today, the 20s we see the rich get very wealthy, but the middle and lower classes and the working class not really gain wealth. And this is going to tie in here because they're not going to be able to consume. Another problem with this is going to be the idea of credit. Many Americans start using too much credit. By the way, have you guys noticed that there are a lot of similarities between the basic fundamentals of our economy today versus the 1920s? We obviously have some regulatory layers to make sure that depressions can't happen anymore. But there are some underlying weaknesses in our economy that are similar to the 1920s economies. So you have uneven distribution of income, overproduction under consumption, you have weak industries, you have a very unstable banking system. The banking system was an issue too, because while the Fed had been put in place to stabilize the banking industry as a reaction to the panic of 1907 and previous problems, there still wasn't a stopgap for confidence. Because while the Fed could move money around, it oftentimes didn't. They did not use the full power of the Fed. The Fed was not nearly as strong as it is today. There are many contractors today who think, you know, that the Fed has too much power, the Fed is uncontrollable, it's not democratic. I would make the argument that having a democratic Fed on some levels might be nice, but do we really want the average American making banking and monetary policy? Because we've seen what happens when the average American elects people to make fiscal policy. We cut taxes and increase spending. In fact, the only group who's been helping out beyond the level of fiscal policy is the banking system, and it's because they tend to be experts in banking. Your congressman is not an expert in fiscal policy, right? Believe it or not. So the banking system itself in the 20s was weak, and they did not use the full arsenal at the disposal of the Fed. And there were several powers the Fed hadn't been given yet, specifically to sort of regulate monetary and circular flow.
Tracy Post, we dial 2141, Tracy Post, 2141, thanks.
And then lastly, let's talk about the international economy. The international economy was weak also. We weren't the only ones who were moving towards depression. America was the largest economy, and our depression affected everyone else's depression greatly. But everyone had some weak underlying problems. In fact, this is going to be one of the reasons why the Soviets will gain some power in the 30s in terms of their argument, because the command economy, the control of the socialist economy in the Soviet Union was able to have an increase in wealth, relative wealth, because they were moving forward quicker industrially. And with that, you saw some people clinging on to the communist idea because they see that in bad times communism could move forward industrially where our capitalist system couldn't. But international economy was weak, and then we kept putting up barriers all over the place. We'll talk more about it, but the Hawley-Smoot tariff, which should be, is it on your notes somewhere? I hope it is. Nope, it's not. The Hawley-Smoot tariff, if you watch Ferris Bueller, it's on Ferris Bueller. Ben Stein says it, you know, the Bueller. He talked about the Hawley-Smoot tariff. This is going to raise tariffs. You know, Hoover did this as a reaction to the Depression, as a way to make sure that Americans are buying American stuff, which would create American jobs. But all it really did was increase prices, shut down walls. As in reaction, England, France, they all put up retaliatory tariffs, and the borders of trade are cut off, and our economy can't expand because there's nowhere to go, because you have these walls created. So the banking, international economy was weak, weak industries domestically, overproduction, underconsumption, uneven distribution of wealth, too many credit problems, and this is going to be the basis for our depression. Now, I'll stop this here in a second, and we'll put it online. If we're not here tomorrow, I'll finish this unit up, so then the last day we can review everything. But this should be enough for you guys to go on, and the only thing we need to talk about in terms of your in terms of your notes is the effects of the Great Depression and Hoover's response to the Great Depression, and this will be not only economic, but there are also some political issues to go along with it. So that should pretty much finish us up. This is really, really important, so use this. If you have to rewind it and go back and rewind it, know this. Know your textbook chapters, right? Make sure you've read Zen, because Zen is going to be an alternative view of the 1920s. In fact, it's going to be a sort of the socialist view of the 1920s that you need to understand, because lots of Americans are thinking this way, right? He's using this primary evidence of the average people. We'll come back tomorrow. We'll talk a lot about it. We're not going to have a ton of time in class, but Tuesday we will. But you need to be studying your essays. You need to be ready for that essay test. It's a big test. We only have a few more before the school year is over, so be ready for this test. Imperialism, World War I, 1920s. Okay?